I am the least racist person. I can't even see the audience because it's so dark, but I don't care who's in the audience. I'm the least racist person in this room.
He pours fuel on every single racist fire. Every single one. Started off his campaign coming down the escalator saying he's going to get rid of those Mexican rapists. He's banned Muslims because they're Muslims. He has moved around and made everything worse across the board.
As the candidates focused on race at last night's debate, Latino voters in Florida are likely to play a deciding factor in the 2020 election. But how they cast their ballots often depends on their country of origin. According to a 2019 estimate by Equis Research, more than half of Florida's eligible Hispanic population are of Cuban or Puerto Rican descent. Mexicans, Colombians, and Dominicans round out the top 5 most common Hispanic ethnicities in the Sunshine State. That specific ethnicity plays a large role in party identification. A midsummer Pew poll found 58% of Cuban Americans nationwide identify as Republicans. That's opposed to 65% of non-Cuban Hispanics who say they are Democrats. For an in-depth look at Latino voters in Florida specifically, I want to bring in Stephanie Valencia. She's the co-founder of She Se Puede and Equis Research, and she joins me now from Washington. Hi, Stephanie. Welcome. Great to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Stephanie, with 11 days to go, CBS News has Florida as a toss-up. And of course, Cuban American voters will play a major role in determining which candidate wins the state. Cuban Americans are still the largest Latino group there in Florida. They are historically Republican-leaning, as they have long perceived the Republican Party to be more hardline anti-Castro. So tell us, how did Mr. Trump fare with this voting group in 2016? And among those Cuban Americans who voted for him then, do they think that he's done a good job?
Well, I'm really glad you started with the slide that you did, because it makes a really important point that the Hispanic electorate in Florida is not just one electorate. In fact, it's not just Cuban or Puerto Rican. It's Cuban, Puerto Rican, and about 40% of the electorate is actually non-Cuban and non-Puerto Rican. So when we think about the role that the Hispanic electorate will play in a place like Florida, we have to think well beyond the Cuban American vote. That being said, the Cuban American vote over the last, really since Obama was president, had, very record gains in that community, has shifted and changed a lot since 2016, and even since 2016 as we head into 2020. And in our latest round of polling, Joe Biden is across the entire Hispanic electorate in Florida is polling well above Donald Trump. But when it comes to Cubans, he's polling at roughly 39%. That being said, in order to win Florida, and in order to win the Hispanic vote in Florida, you really need to push to the margins of like 40% or more, which Joe Biden will very likely exceed in these closing days among the Cuban American vote. Now, related to your question around why are Cuban Americans supporting Donald Trump, I think there are really 3 factors that we can point to. One is the economy, and whatever perceptions of the health and well-being of the economy, whether or not people are actually feeling that benefit in their own personal lives, they perceive that Donald Trump is doing a good job on the economy. Secondly, there are a number of different factors that we can kind of relate to around year of arrival to this country, or younger versus older Cuban Americans. Specifically, were you born here in the United States and are of Cuban descent, or were you born on the island of Cuba? That's a very big distinguisher among support for President Trump. And if you did come from the island, what year did you arrive? Post-1993 arrivals are actually a very interesting case study, because they were the ones who supported Barack Obama, but have kind of faltered and switched over to Trump somewhat over the last 10 years. So it's a very interesting group of people that is not solid, super solid in their vote choice, and again went from Obama to Trump. And then the third is, the messaging that you've heard from Donald Trump and conservatives on the right around socialism, and the media ecosystem that they have built in South Florida through radio and digital has really hammered home that message of socialism that has stuck and solidified certain parts of the Cuban electorate.
Right, that is interesting. That messaging does seem to have made inroads. So do Democrats have room to grow among Florida's Cuban American voters, especially, as you pointed out, the younger generations who were born here and certainly seemed, at least in 2016, to be less conservative than their parents? I don't know if that's shifting as they themselves get older. But is there room for Democrats to cut into that pretty solid Cuban American voting bloc in Florida?
Absolutely. We estimate that there's roughly 40% of the Cuban American electorate in Florida that is up for grabs. And we believe, and we've seen with the kind of deluge of television and radio and digital spend that we're seeing in the state of Florida, that Joe Biden and progressives are talking to those voters in addition to Republicans. And so those voters are very much up for grabs. And again, they're made up of those U.S.-born Cuban Americans who tend to be younger, and then those who came after 1993. And there's a huge conversation to be had with them, even on the economy. The current state of the economy right now, kind of given where we are with COVID on healthcare and the state of healthcare in this country today and the state of COVID and handling of COVID are all places where Democrats can have a very proactive conversation with these voters, because issues like access to quality healthcare, the state of the small businesses and COVID and the state of the economy right now can all be laid at Donald Trump's, and the blame can be laid at Donald Trump's feet. Whether or not people are actually communicating that message to Cuban Americans to help persuade them to vote for Joe Biden is what we need to see in these last days of the election.
Stephanie, as you pointed out, Hispanic voters in Florida are certainly not a monolith, and your research also focused on the 40% of Hispanic voters there who are neither Cuban nor Puerto Rican. You've dubbed them the LATAM vote. Why are these voters not studied as much, and how crucial are they for Joe Biden to win Florida?
They are absolutely crucial to his path to victory in Florida. And, we often think about the Hispanic electorate in Florida in very binary terms. You're either Cuban or you're Puerto Rican. And each of those subgroups only make up, as you can see, 29% and 27% of the population. But 40% of the electorate is this LATAM vote, which is, Mexican, Colombian, Venezuelan. And often we hear a lot about in the news about Venezuelan voters in Florida and the part of the electorate they make up. It's actually a relatively small share. We believe that the conversation about Venezuela is often used as a proxy war to solidify the Cuban American Republican base in Florida. But the LATAM voters, supporting Joe Biden right now at 60+ percentage points, he obviously has a lot of room to grow in terms of that support among that group, and to increase that support and turnout among Latin American voters who, represent a very large share of the electorate in Florida and who are predispositioned to support a candidate like Joe Biden. And so if I were spending money and thinking about these final days of the election, I would spend money and trying to find how to reach and engage and increase support among that group, because it's almost certain to yield in a vote for Joe Biden.
Okay, let's dive specifically into male Hispanic voters, Stephanie, because the New York Times, as Jennifer Medina, had a fascinating piece about the so-called macho allure of President Trump among Latino men. It is especially high among male Mexican voters, apparently. What do you make of that, and is that something that your research bears out?
Well, I think this trend we're seeing among Hispanic men is something that we're seeing across a lot of different subgroups of younger men of color and younger men generally. And so I think Democrats are going to really have to study this trend after this election cycle, because I really think there are three driving factors to understanding this. One is their belief that Trump is handling the economy well. And again, whether or not their own personal economic situation is faring better than it was before, they think he is doing a good job. Second is they believe in this kind of like Trump intrigue, which is, the businessman that he is, the success that they feel like he's been able to accomplish, and that they also want to see for themselves and for their families. And so I think that is something that they often identify with him as well. And I think just his cult of personality and his take no prisoners kind of attitude is something else that they very much relate to. And so I think those three things really add up to what I call Trump intrigue, which is an interest interest and understanding and kind of maybe supporting him generally. But in a place like Arizona, which Jenny's story really focused on, when we look at Hispanic males who are intrigued by Trump, 40% of them may say, especially of younger Hispanic men, say that they support or are favorable to Donald Trump. But when you ask if they are actually going to vote for him, only 25% say that they will consider actually voting for him. So you see this big gap between their intrigue and interest in who he is and what he represents, and whether or not they can actually stomach going to cast a vote for them. So the likelihood of them actually staying home feels pretty high, because they may not be fired up about Joe Biden either, but they're not necessarily ready to go cast their ballot for Donald Trump.
Very interesting. You talk about voter turnout. Do you see in Florida that the Latino voter across the board is excited to cast a vote for this election?
We're seeing super high levels of motivation. We finished a poll at the end of September, and what we've seen in the news here very much reflects what we are seeing in our polling, which is levels of motivation are very high in Florida among the Hispanic electorate. So you see people who are very motivated. Cuban Americans are historically very motivated to vote, and they turn out in high numbers in proportion to their part of the population. But we're seeing those high levels of motivation across Puerto Ricans and non-Cuban, non-Puerto Ricans as well. And I think you can see that reflected in the long lines of people standing in the rain for hours on end to cast their vote and to vote early. In a place like Florida, I think that motivation will continue over these last 11 days, and I think you'll continue to see those long lines on Election Day.
All right, Stephanie Valencia of Equis Research, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.